from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank my distinguished colleague from Rhode Island. I just have a time pressure that otherwise I would understand, and I appreciate his courtesy. Madam President, I thought this debate would be a watershed moment, a moment when we would finally move beyond Republican attempts to deny global warming exists. But as this debate has evolved, we see that we have not gotten very far. Instead of deny, the Republican playbook has shifted to delay, delay, and delay. Madam President, the time to act is actually now. We're not going to be able to transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a green, renewable, energy-based economy overnight, and therefore it is critical that we act as soon as possible to begin this transition. And I want to thank my colleagues who have worked so hard to get this legislation at least to the floor. The mere fact that we are having this debate gets us closer to actually enacting a policy to cap greenhouse gas emissions. But I do hope that in time we can support much stronger legislation. I have concerns about whether this bill speeds our transition to a carbon-free economy quickly enough. Because of the cost containment measures and the large numbers of offsets in the bill, I'm worried that some companies might be able to delay cutting back their emissions for over a decade. I also believe we can go even farther in supporting renewable sources and energy efficiency. I was hoping that I would have the opportunity to offer a few amendments to improve upon this legislation, and I certainly want to offer them as we have offered them. I know probably will not get to them under the procedures that we are in the midst of pursuing, but I think that they are markers for the future. The first amendment I had hoped to offer, along with Senators Lautenberg and Sanders, would have shifted transition assistance funding from big oil to renewable energy generators. At a time of record oil company profits, I do not think we really need to allow oil companies to pollute for free, especially when that money could be used to help jumpstart the development of clean, renewable, affordable American energy. The second amendment I authored along with Senator Snowe would have boosted funding to help developing nations adapt to changes in the climate they had little to no part in creating in the first place. Making investments to help vulnerable nations isn't just a necessary step to secure an effective international climate treaty or just a way to advance U.S. national security interests. It is a moral imperative. And the third amendment I filed with Senator Kerry would help nations with tropical forests lower their rates of deforestation, a cost-effective way of keeping CO2 out of the atmosphere. Approximately 20% of global global greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation, and if we hope to secure an effective climate treaty, we must be willing to help forested nations create the tools they need to effectively address the problems. Finally, the fourth amendment I authored also with Senator Kerry would require the government to calculate the cost of inaction on global warming, from the cost of drought to flooding to storm damage. Now, many of my friends on the other side of the aisle have spent a lot of time this week bemoaning the alleged costs of solving global warming, but they have completely ignored the horrendous costs of ignoring global warming. We need the study so we are not always looking at half the balance sheet on this issue. Now, many of my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle are rejecting any efforts we might propose out of hand. They argue that almost anything would cost too much. They suggest that any effort to go green on the scale necessary would be too expensive. Saying we can't invest in renewable energy because there's a dollar figure attached sounds like someone telling someone with a fatal disease that the cure is too costly, or saying to a crime victim that we can't afford to put police on the streets because it has a cost. There are some who argue that it would be too expensive to reinforce the levees in New Orleans, and when Hurricane Katrina hit, we found out what the true cost of that decision was. We can't fail again to listen to John F. Kennedy when he warned us that the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. The question isn't whether an investment needs to be made. The question is whether we want to make that investment now, while we can do it safely, gradually, and inexpensively, or later, when we have to make wholesale changes to our economy in a matter of years rather than decades. In other words, what we're deciding is not whether to put a cap on carbon emissions. The question is whether we do it now or whether we wait. Do we do it now when it's cheaper to do it, when we can set ourselves up to compete with Europe and Japan in creating new technologies, when we can create jobs in the midst of an economic turndown? Or do we do it when our hand is forced, when Americans have already felt the catastrophic effects of climate change, when our coasts are flooded, when storm surges damage our houses and droughts threaten our harvests, when the costs become enormous because we have to change so quickly? It's going to be far harder and far more expensive to have to stop carbon emissions overnight than to do it now. If we want to slash our carbon emissions 80% by 2050, we simply cannot wait until 2030 to get started, unless we want to risk the economic and environmental future of this country. Today, in the rising price of gas we have to pay at the pump, we see the result of waiting till disaster strikes to act. In the 1970s, because of the Arab oil embargo, we drastically improved the fuel efficiency of our passenger vehicles. In 1976, our cars and trucks got 13 miles per gallon. But by 1981, our fleet had improved to 21 miles per gallon. But from 1981 to 2006, the average fuel economy of our passenger vehicle fleet actually declined to 20 miles per gallon. If we had been gradually improving efficiency standards instead of waiting for high gas prices to force our hand, we would all be better off today. If we had increased fuel economy a modest 2% per year, our new fleet of vehicles would now average 34 miles per gallon. And astonishingly, if we had followed this course, our current demand for oil would be over 1/3 less than it is today, down over 2 billion barrels of oil per year. Cumulatively, we would have saved over 30 billion barrels of oil, and 30 billion barrels of oil is more oil than the entire proven oil reserves remaining in the United States. With such a reduced demand for oil, imagine how much less we'd be paying for gas today. Now, some of my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle are suggesting that capping carbon emissions would cause energy and gas prices to go up. Well, the reality is anyone can tell you that prices have been going up and that they will continue to go up under the present policy of this administration unless we end our dependence on oil. And that means transitioning to free, renewable fuels like wind and solar. We don't have to pay Saudi Arabia for the rights to use the sun to generate power. We don't have to send money to Nigeria for the right to harness the power of wind. The more we improve the technology that can run on renewable fuels, the cheaper every kind of fuel will be. But solving global warming is not just about protecting us from catastrophic weather and hostile foreign regimes. It's also about jobs. Renewable energy industries are perhaps the single greatest opportunity to create new, good-paying jobs this country has seen in a generation. If we want to put up millions of solar panels, it's going to take hundreds of thousands of workers to install them. And those jobs are created here at home, unlike what happens when we continue to rely on oil, which is where we create jobs in the Middle East, in Nigeria, Venezuela, to name a few.